So, João, please come to me. So let's see, what have you learned in the school? So when you look at us, so next to each other, what do you see? Only, sorry? True, but what else?
Two guys with a J starting own name, 4 letters, so very similar names.
Okay, what else? You are close, you are close. Okay, we will not be.
No,
No.
so much.
He's not from the Mediterranean.
Yeah,
Okay, this is one reason. Okay, guys. So I see you fell asleep in the school. So this is Spain, this is Portugal, this is the peninsula, the
Iberian Peninsula.
Yeah. Guys, so now you learned something, okay? Oh my God. So, João, my dear. So this is a challenge for you because life could be very hard. There are some people who start learning with others in groups here, then they got a Keynote, and then they got an MIAPPPP. So
you missed some
you know the challenge for you now. No? So what's going to happen next year? So thanks so much for being there.
Thank you.
Enjoy.
Thank you so much. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is João Proença, and this is my talk, Limitless Within Our Boundaries. As Pepe just said, I come from Lisbon, Portugal. I am a quality engineer at a company called OutSystems, and I've lived all of my life in Lisbon. I grew up in it. And to be honest, the things I want to talk about here today kind of started to occur to me a long time ago when I was a teenager, something like that. You see, from a very early stage, I was really, really interested in music. Not just listening to music and researching about music and just understanding it, but also creating music and being able to play. So when I was with 13 years or something like that, I started learning how to play the guitar. And then eventually I reached high school and I started playing together with friends. One thing led to the other, and after a while we started entertaining the idea of putting a band together. Now, one very good friend of mine, he's a bass player, and he came up to me one day and was like, hey João, my parents are out for the weekend, so we have the apartment all for ourselves. Why don't we gather everyone up and let's see what we can make in the apartment with our instruments. Let's try to put some songs together. Okay, and so we were excited. So we're doing this. We're going to form a garage band, and we're going to make our own music. Let's get our gear and walk into the apartment. Now, when I say gear, we were kids. We had no money, okay? So basically, I had the cheapest electric guitar that money could buy. It was actually that model over there. And I had an even cheaper amp, which was something like this big that you should just use to practice, not exactly to play gigs or to record anything. The bass player, he didn't have a bass, actually, so he just borrowed an old bass from a neighbor or something. And he didn't have an amplifier, so what he did is that he plugged the bass directly into his father's home stereo, the ones that had a CD and a cassette player. You remember, it was the 90s. And then the drummer was the same story. He didn't have a drum kit, so we just borrowed from someone a really old drum kit. And to top that off, the singer, she just had one of those 10 euros microphones that you plugged into our PCs back then. And this was our gear, and we just used it to record our songs. But things worked out. We got our creative flow going ahead. We used it. And by the end of that weekend, we were able to record 3 songs into one of these things, an old school cassette. okay? And we were really excited, really proud of ourselves. And over the next few days and weeks, we started sharing our demo to our friends. And eventually, someone from school invited us to play a gig at the next school party. And we were excited. From beginning until 2 weeks later, we were delivering our first concert. So it was all happening really fast. We started rehearsing, and we got on that stage, and it worked really well. You know, 3 songs plus a couple of covers, and it just flowed really nicely. Over the next few years, people would come to me, and they would tell me, hey, I was at that concert that day. I remember. It was so memorable. I just wanted you to know that. So I knew that we made an impact. Now, that set us off. I mean, it was like the perfect beginning for a garage band. And so we started, let's level things up. We started rehearsing more. We did a few more gigs. And after a while, when we were beginning college, we decided to take it to the next level. We now had some money that we had amassed, and that had allowed us to get some better instruments. So now I had a better guitar, I had a proper amplifier, big-ass amplifier, a lot of effects pedals. Everyone in the band was equipped, and we managed to get some money to rent some recording studio time. You know, 3 days in a recording studio, professional thing, with a sound engineer available to work with us. Let's build a proper sounding demo. Let's go in and do our thing. Walking into that recording studio was kind of like walking into the candy shop, you know? It's like, look at all of these guitars and so many amplifiers and effects. I mean, it's the perfect place to set our creativity loose, okay? And so we were really excited. We walked there, and we were pumped. Okay, let's do this. We have 3 days. Let's come up with some new songs. Let's record them and create our professional sounding demo. Are you ready? We hit the record button, and then we froze. Suddenly, whatever had happened in that apartment those years before was not happening anymore. The magic wasn't there. We were kind of like always second-doubting ourselves, like, I did this take, but maybe I should use that guitar, or maybe the problem is with the drums. You made a mistake, right? Things were not working. And it got so hard and so uncomfortable that time passed by, and by the end of the 3 days that we had of studio time, we had nothing to show for. 0 songs recorded. It was a complete failure. Now, this was a pivotal moment for my band because it was the beginning of the end. After that, we were constantly fighting in rehearsals, on stage, true story. And we basically reached the point where we had to decide if we were going to remain in a band or if we were going to remain as friends. And we decided to remain as friends, of course. So the band was over. And the thing is, this was a long time ago, like, I don't know, 15 or 16 years ago. And for the longest time, I couldn't quite put what had happened in that recording studio that made us fail so miserably. But then time passed by, and a few years ago, so a long time after the events, I figured it out. So I was driving my car to the beach, not kidding. I was like, my wife, my 2 kids, driving my car to the beach, and I was listening to a podcast episode about some topic, and what they were telling me suddenly clicked in my mind. And all of a sudden, I understood what had happened in that recording studio. The problem that we had all those years before was choices. Let me explain. So, the podcast episode was describing something called the JAM study, okay? And the JAM study is a paramount study that was done and that has influenced all the research around decision-making and choices and whatnot. The JAM study was coined by Sheena Iyengar and Mark Lepper from Stanford and Columbia Universities in the late 90s. And it was an experiment. In this experiment, they went to a supermarket, to a grocery store, and they went in there and they set up a jam how do you call it, a stand where they would offer you different flavors of jam for you to taste, and if you wanted to purchase some, you would purchase, okay? And what they did was, let's imagine, on Monday, you would walk into the store and you would see this stand with someone offering you jam, and you had 24 choices of jam. On Tuesday, you would see the same stand, but the difference was that you would only see 6 choices of jam. And then they did this a lot of times. So on Wednesday, back to the 24. On Thursday, back to the 6. And they did this over a few weeks so that they could collect data and analyze the data. Here's what they found. On the days where you had 24 choices of jam, they attracted 60% of shoppers, which means that 60% of anyone who would walk into the store would stop by the booth and taste some jam. Shoppers sampled on average 2 flavors, and in the end, 3% of those 60% would purchase jam. Okay? When you only saw 6 choices of jam, they attracted 40% of shoppers, so less people than when you had the 24 choices. Shoppers sampled the same average 2 flavors, but 30% of shoppers purchased jam. So even though you had less choices, you were selling more, because 30% of 40% is much more than 3% of 60. And this has become, as I said, a paramount study that's widely regarded and repeated around decision-making, and it has influenced a lot of research that came afterwards. Actually, there are even supermarket chains that people argue, no one knows for sure, that we believe that followed what we found with this in the way that they conduct their business. The most notable examples being Aldi and Lidl here in Germany, where you walk in and basically you have two different brands for the same category of product. And so they bet on you making fast and easy decisions rather than having a lot of choice, okay? In the US, you also have Trader Joe's, which is actually owned by Aldi. Now, the thing with the jam study, for me, so there are like 2 key ideas to take from the jam study. The first one is kind of obvious to me. Having too many choices blocks our decision-making. So the more choices that we have, the harder it will be for us to decide. And that was kind of obvious to me. The second idea wasn't that obvious to me, and it was really fascinating. We, as human beings, tend to prefer having many choices. And this is what we call the paradox of choice, is that it's hardwired into us wanting to have a lot of choices. You know, inside the supermarket, when you had more choices, more people would stop by the booth. But when you had fewer choices, more people decided, and the store ended up selling more. Okay? Now, once I've learned about the paradox of choice, I started seeing it in a lot of places around me. Let me ask you a question. Who here owns a streaming service subscription like Netflix, HBO, or let me see a show of hands? Like, okay, almost everyone, okay? So now let me see who has been in this situation like myself. So it's like late nights, my kids are in bed, it's my moment, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to have my quality time to watch a movie or a TV show or something. I fire up Netflix, and after 30 minutes, I'm still looking at the menu. I see some hands in the air. Okay. Okay, and it's like, you know, if I compare this experience, and it's like, so Netflix gives like a multitude of options, and you sit down and you have to decide, and then you get, and I'm not sure if this TV show will be better than that one and whatnot. And I remember when I was a kid, back in the early 90s, in Portugal, we didn't have a lot of options. There was no cable, and I had like 4 channels, so the same experience would be something like, okay, channel 1, channel 2, channel 3, channel 4, I guess I'm watching The Simpsons again. So the decision was like a few seconds, you know, it was like that. But still, maybe even some of us own more than one subscription service, you know? Because I want to have all of the options available, and some of the things are not on Netflix, you know? So there's the paradox of choice. You want more options, but then you don't watch anything because it's hard to choose. Here's another place where I've also seen the paradox of choice manifesting in front of me. So, as I've already hinted, I'm the father of 2 small boys, and I started noticing, growing up, especially during the pandemic, that whenever I tried them to get to their room, like, go play in your room, please, and the room is full of toys, usually they don't play with any of the toys. They don't decide. And they end up like running around the house or climbing the walls like this little fella over here. You know, they will do anything except play with their choice. But if I change the setup a little bit, especially for the little one, he's like 3 years old, if I like move him to another room, I just give him like a couple of options of toys, I have a better chance of him focusing on the toy and engaging with the toy. And I'm not exactly making this up. This has been researched, and even like maybe some of you are acquainted with the Montessori method of teaching, which actually believes that you need to constrain the number of options you give kids, and this has influenced a number of kindergartens throughout the world. Okay? Now, if I go back to the band story, I think it's a bit obvious what happened. I mean, we weren't prepared to deal with so many choices walking into that recording studio. All of a sudden, it was like 10 guitars, I don't know how many amplifiers, a lot of decisions to make throughout our creative process. When you're recording something, even the distance that you set the microphone from the amplifier is a decision you need to make because it will influence the sound that you get from the instruments. And basically, we spent the whole time second-doubting ourselves, not knowing exactly what to choose, and that made us completely defocus and completely fail on our objectives. Now, let me be clear about something. I'm not saying that having a lot of choices or options is necessarily bad, okay? I'm going to use a quote by Sheena Iyengar herself, one of the people that made the JAM study. It's not that more choice is always worse and that less is always better. It is both a limiting and a powerful tool, okay? Another person who has thoroughly studied the paradox of choice is this gentleman called Barry Schwartz. He actually wrote a book called The Paradox of Choice, and we researched this a lot during the 2000s decades. And if you're interested in knowing more about the paradox, I highly recommend checking out his TED Talk. He tells us one thing, which I find very interesting, that he believes that there's this, let's say, official dogma of Western societies. And the dogma is that to maximize the welfare of our citizens, so how well our citizens are doing and how happy they are, we need to maximize their freedom, okay? And to maximize their freedom, we need to maximize their choices. And he says this is a dogma and it's fundamentally false, okay? This is what he argues. Having no choice is bad, usually, okay? Having some choice is usually better than having no choice at all, but having a lot of choice is not necessarily better. And this is key to what I'm trying to express here today. According to him, to Barry Schwartz, lots of choices leaves us paralyzed, as I've already showed you with all of the stories that I've told you about Netflix and my band and whatnot. But a lot of choice also leaves us miserable. So when you have a lot of choice in front of you, it's not a pleasant feeling. First, fear of missing out. I mean, if you have a lot of choices, I mean, you're about to decide on something and you're already thinking about the things that you're giving up in order to go into that direction. So you start thinking about the opportunity costs of all of the choices that you left behind. Sometimes you may even like go decide one thing and then you're like, I think I chose unwisely, and you go back and then you choose something different. And what this makes before you do the decision is that it just escalates our expectations immensely, you know? Because and personally, it's kind of like if I have to do something and I have few choices available, I choose one thing. If it goes wrong, it's like, hey, I guess I didn't have a lot of options, and that was the problem. But if you have all of the possible options available to you, all of a sudden it's on you. Okay? It's like if I choose unwisely, it's not that I didn't have the opportunity to choose the best thing, I just chose unwisely. So we become perfectionists when we have a lot of choices and a lot of options. But nevertheless, even though this is what having a lot of options does to us, we still want to have all of those options. It's the paradox. It's ingrained in us as human beings. Here's another thing I want to tell you about decision-making and choices. You look at these three images. What is the one thing that you see that's common to all of them, other than the fact that Barack Obama is in all of them? This suit. And Barack Obama famously wore most of the times the same suit because he acknowledged publicly the decision fatigue. So having to do a lot of decisions throughout the day has been proven to tire us. And basically, as you are doing the decisions in sequence, the quality of those decisions starts to degrade. So if he was president of the United States, so he had a lot of decisions to make throughout the day, he didn't want to spend his decision capital early in the morning in having to choose a new suit from his wardrobe. So basically, he had like 1 or 2 suits that were repeated throughout the whole wardrobe. It was like basically put the hand, take one of them out, and that was it. And this is also a concept which I believe it's important for what I want to say next. So I've already told you a lot of stuff about choices and decision-making. If I were you sitting there right now, I would probably be thinking, okay, João, this is very interesting, but why the hell are we talking about the paradox of choice in an Agile Testing conference? I believe that since I've learned from the paradox of choice, I started seeing it happening in front of my eyes in a lot of situations, especially in my professional life. And I believe it's an important thing to take into account in our space, in the testing community and in the quality space. First, let me explain what I mean with this. So I believe that a lot of choices have a big impact on our creativity and our focus. Having a lot of choices can make us focus on the wrong things. Okay? Let me explain why, and I'm going to give you another example. Who here is a fan of Star Wars? Okay, you're not a fan, okay. I'm a big fan of Star Wars. I grew up in the 90s watching the old trilogy, mesmerized by its brilliance and loving the story, the lore of Star Wars, the characters. It was awesome. So obviously, by the mid-90s, when they announced that George Lucas was preparing the prequel trilogy that followed, everyone was really excited. And then in 1999, it started coming out, and most of us were disappointed. Okay? At least I was disappointed, but most people consider that the prequel trilogy that came afterwards is inferior to the original trilogy. And a lot of people have argued why that was the case. I mean, what happened with Lucas and whatever he was putting together, and they have argued about the lackluster, some lackluster acting, or maybe an unpolished script, you name it. However, there was another thing which I believe happened, and I'm not the only one, I did my research, so I believe it happened, and a few people also believe happened, that may explain why the prequels were a bit inferior. One thing that some people do not realize, maybe, is that with the original trilogy, Lucas was working under a lot of constraints. In the 70s, sci-fi was still seen as a risk. You know, Star Wars changed that. But the movie industry didn't know exactly what to do with sci-fi. So they gave him a limited budget to come up with the first Star Wars movie. At the same time, special effects technology was still at the stage where you could only do as much. And these things were all limitations for what Lucas wanted to put on the screen and build the universe that he wanted to build. Now, if we compare that to what happened in the 90s, by the time he was making the prequel, sci-fi was mainstream. The biggest movies in the box office were sci-fi movies. he had a huge budget. Everyone was throwing money at Lucas to come up with this thing. And we were seeing the appearance of CGI, so computer generated imagery, which meant for Lucas that now anything that he could think of could go on a screen. Maybe you're already seeing where I'm getting at with this. In the 70s, the constraints that Lucas had were actually good for him, because they forced him to focus on other things that are really important, like the universe, the lore, the script that he was putting together. In the 90s, a lot of people argue that he started doing stuff for technology's sake rather than the story's sake or Star Wars' sake, you know? There are even tales of how he only recorded some of the scenes with the actors and actresses like in one take, you know? It didn't give them a chance to repeat their work in order to achieve perfection. Just wanted to go back to the CGI lab and put new, amazing images together. The best example that you had was this character, Jar Jar Binks, which to this day, a lot of people, like myself, argue is completely unnecessary in the story of the Phantom Menace. But at the time, it was a marvel, a technological marvel. It was like one of the first completely synthetic talking characters in a movie. And so a lot of people argue that George Lucas fell so in love with technology that he focused too much on it and not as much in other things that were also very important. Now, if I take this over to things I've seen in my professional life, I mean, how many times have we seen this? I mean, I've lost count to the number of times I talk to someone or engage with someone. They're really excited because, hey, we're building this thing and it's awesome and blah, 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 and it's going to change the world. And I'm like, okay, but why are you doing this? What's the purpose? What problem are you solving? And then I get an answer like Kubernetes, blockchain, AI, big data. And it's like I've seen, especially recently, you see all of these examples of people trying to fix specific problems by using blockchain when blockchain makes absolutely zero sense for the problem that we're trying to fix. So I believe that this also happens to us. We sometimes fell in love with our own technologies and we kind of forget about the problems that we're trying to fix. And so sometimes less is more. And as I've shown you with the Star Wars George Lucas story, he didn't know. He wanted more options back in the 70s, but he was having few options was actually a blessing in disguise. It gave him the right context in order to come up with something that was inspirational to millions of people and changed the movie industry forever. But he didn't know at the time that lack of options was actually a good thing. He wanted more options, and he got them in the 90s. Here's another story about wanting more options that has happened to me personally. So about 14 years ago, I was a junior quality assurance engineer starting my career in this space. And I remember that I was working in this company, so I was doing a lot of test automation. I worked with one team. There was a few colleagues of mine that did the same in their teams. And I had this older colleague of mine, more experienced, that we discussed a lot of things. And I distinctively remember this episode where basically he came to me and started telling me, so we had this task management tool that we had built in-house. And he was very excited because he was building a new module or a new subsystem for something. He was like, look at this awesome architecture, and I've added these abstractions over here, and I'm doing this and that. And I was like, okay, man, that seems very interesting, but very complex at the same time. Why did you put so much complexity into this subsystem? And he said something that stuck with me. I want to keep my options open. Like, you know, those third parties that we are using, with this thing, if we want to change them in the future, we can do it like that. Or if I predict that in a couple of months, people will want more features, and with this architecture, it will be awesome, it will be amazing, it will be the easiest thing to put those features into the product. So you know what happened next? 2 months later, that colleague of mine, he went away, he changed companies. People looked at his system and they were like, I have no idea how this is built. It was completely unapproachable. And eventually some manager just decided to throw it out and let's just build something new because this is just way too complicated and the system didn't even fit our needs. So for me, this was kind of like a manifestation of Yagni. You ain't gonna need it, you know? Instead of building a simple thing, let's say a thing filled with limitations, but that trying to do an experiment to see if it worked, he tried over-engineering with that idea of, I want more options. It's the paradox at stake, you know? Like, it's ingrained in us wanting to have more options, and then it leads us to these sorts of decisions, you know? But people shouldn't be afraid of building something and learning from that, and then if you have to rebuild it from scratch when you do the next iteration, then just do it. So he wanted more options, but in fact, he desperately needed more constraints, even though he didn't know at the time. He had to leave the company for that to become obvious. Not having those constraints sometimes can lead us to paralysis, as we learned from the JAM study. It can make us focus on just one thing and maybe not even the right thing, and it can make us tired because of decision fatigue, as we learned from Barack Obama's suits. Now, here's another way I think that the paradox of choice has been really important in my current state in my career. So nowadays I'm a quality engineer, and over the past few years I've been working in a whole team approach to testing situation, which means my teams, we try as a team to move quality and testing forward. I am the quality engineer embedded, and I'm there to make the team successful at doing that. I am a coach and enabler of teams. I teach them about test strategies, and I try working with developers in order for them to know how to think about testability. I do a lot of quality analysis, like quality assessments, identifying risk mitigation activities, which of course involve a lot of testing. And then I'm a champion for DevOps and CI/CD as well as observability as much as I can. And I believe that the work that I do here, which is kind of like an enabler work, where I try to make the team successful at testing and quality topics, in that sort of work, it's really important for one to acknowledge the paradox of choice and the power of setting up the right set of constraints for teams to be successful. Here's an example. So I started in this role as a quality engineer in January of 2017. And I remember that in that team, like the team leader was really excited from day one. Like, finally, I have a testing specialist in my team. Let's do testing. Let's do lots and lots and lots of testing. And I was like, that seems like a good idea, but let's take a step back and think a little bit about what's the goal. I mean, why do you want to test? What do you want to test? What are the risks that we're trying to prevent? And that made him think, and so he started like, okay, that makes sense. So how do we come up with these quality risks? And we didn't have a good idea, and he kind of suggested, I know, let's gather up the team and do a brainstorm, okay? We'll just brainstorm around quality risks. Now, this sort of unstructured brainstorming format that he was suggesting, it's not exactly the kind of thing that's my cup of tea, you know? It's not that there's nothing wrong with unstructured brainstorming, but sometimes I believe that it's used for things that maybe it's not the best approach. I find that when you try to look at quality risks in such a way, you end up the people in the brainstorming session may end up focusing too much on one thing, or maybe they sidetrack completely to something that's not that important. So what happened next was that I tried finding a different way. So I was going to testing conference by then. I went to a testing conference and I got a hold of Baron van Dijl, one of the creators of risk storming, which is a kind of structured way of looking at quality risks. And he taught me about how to facilitate a risk storming session, and then I ended up bringing that to the organization. and conducting quality analysis through that. So I'm going to briefly explain how this works, just to pass a point. If anyone wants to know more details, just catch me after the keynote, and I'll tell you all about it, but I won't go into deep detail. When you do risk storming, there's a few constraints put into the mix. First, you have a test for your card deck. These are cards that hold a lot of testing industry knowledge in them, and you can use them for a number of formats. And using those tests for your cards, people go through 3 phases. In the first phase, the group needs to define what are the 6 most important quality aspects for the remainder of the risk storming session. Under those quality aspects, they need to find out what are the most important risks, so brainstorm around risks. And then with the risks identified, they come up with mitigations. Now, the quality aspects here is the part that I want to focus, because I've done dozens of risk storming sessions at my current role. And one of the things that I find, and when I say quality aspects, I'm talking about things like data or security, performance, accessibility. So there are different quality domains in which you can think of things that can go wrong. So it's perfect for this sort of exercise. And with all of the sessions that I've done, I found that this first phase is actually really, really important, because it sets a number of constraints to the group that's very important for what comes next. They go from a situation where they have unlimited options, like unstructured brainstorm. Anything that we can think of is viable. They go to 20 options because there are 20 quality aspect cards in the test sphere card deck. And from those 20 options, they go into 6 options, which are the 6 most important ones that they need to elect. Okay? And because they do this, they get 2 things. The first one is that they need to constrain the exercise, and they make it obvious. So there are 6 quality aspects that they need to cover, and it's only those 6. We've already said that all of the other things are less important, so let's keep us inside of that scope. And that makes the risk brainstorming part much more effective, because they know what they have to cover, and they know in which area they should be thinking about risks, and sessions end up being much more successful. Now, another place where I've seen kind of like the paradox of choice appearing in some way, when you have risk mitigations, of course that one very popular and commonly used risk mitigation activity is exploratory testing, okay? Most of what I've learned about exploratory testing comes from Elizabeth Hendrickson's excellent Explore It book. And Elizabeth teaches us at the very beginning about 2 things which are really important. Exploratory testing sessions should be chartered on one hand, and they should also be time-boxed. And when I see this, I see setting up constraints so that you can be successful once again. Sessions should be chartered in the sense that you should clearly define the scope of what you want to explore, and maybe try not to deviate too much outside of it. And they should be time-boxed, because the more time you have, the more options you end up having. I mean, I have plenty of time. I can look at that other thing later on. I'm going to go deep into this thing. And that ends up bringing decision fatigue. That ends up making you focus on things that maybe you shouldn't be focusing so much in this specific session. So for me, it's once again an example of how setting up the right set of constraints is very important in order to have a valuable exercise. Now, the way we are doing exploratory testing most of the times at my organization is through ensemble testing. So we have a group of people with different profiles doing exploratory testing in front of a system or a new feature together and throwing ideas to it. And I've seen how important the chartered and time-boxed approach is because whenever the scope is not that well defined and the sessions don't really have an end time, it's very easy for the group to start going too too deep into just one thing and not knowing other important things that they should also cover. Or maybe they completely sidetrack to something that's not even the goal of the session itself. So these are just a few examples of me being a quality engineer, a coach, an enabler inside of a team, how I've seen that setting the right set of constraints is fundamental to set the team for success. And an analogy that I usually make here is like, if the team doesn't have a testing specialist or a quality engineer in it, it's like being in the desert, you know? You're trying to find the quality oasis, the end goal, but you don't really know where you're going. So maybe I go this direction, but then I start second-doubting myself because the mountains are over there, so maybe the oasis is that way. So you have so many options that you just get lost. Having a quality engineer in there is kind of like giving that person a compass. Well, all of a sudden, I just say, go north. And the team still needs to do a lot of stuff. They need to overcome obstacles. They need to deviate here and there, but they know what the purpose, what the direction is. The number of directions is kind of discrete, and that really helps them being successful in achieving their goals. Okay, so I've already covered a lot of stuff regarding the paradox of choice, and also about how I've seen it materializing in my professional life. But there's one final thing, because I don't think that we can talk about the paradox of choice in this day and age without bringing up another topic that's very important in our industry right now. So, when I was a kid, and I've said this a lot of times during this talk, I remember being bored a lot, okay? So I went to the doctor's office. I waited for like 1 hour, 2 hours for the doctor to see me. It was boring as hell. And it was the same experience as like going to my grandma's house or an aunt's house or something that wasn't a part of my plan, because I was a kid and I basically wanted to play with my toys or play with my friends on the street and whatnot. And what ended up happening in those, I'm at the doctor's office and this is taking forever and I have no options of things to do. I just have to wait. I ended up like taking those old magazines you see at the doctor's office, picking up one of the pages and then just building a paper plane and start annoying everyone with it, you know? It was like, boredom is really good for your creativity, for coming up with these things. It's actually fundamental. But nowadays, this sort of experience is kind of impossible, right? Because, I mean, if you just have your smartphone on your pocket, even in these situations, the number of options available to you is immense. I mean, I'm at the doctor's office. I can watch a TV show, I can watch a movie, I can read a book, I can catch up on Twitter, I can watch cat videos, whatever. There's a big number of things that I can do. Maybe I even like can't decide what I'm going to do next while I'm waiting for the doctor to see me. And what's even more extreme is that this is not just about the boring moments anymore. Sometimes we're in a situation where we should be engaging with something, like we're experiencing something, like we're at a football match, we're at the movies, we're at, I don't know, we're at a soccer match, something like that, and just we're thinking about the other things that we could be doing instead, and as soon as you have that little bit of boredom, like let's say the referee stops the game for a few seconds because there was a foul, and you're like, well, maybe I can, while I have these seconds, I'll check up what's going on WhatsApp, what my friends are saying, or maybe I'll look at that cat video that my good friend Jose sent me 30 minutes ago, or maybe I'll take a look at that work email that I got an hour ago from my boss. And this is where I'm trying to get at. The way technology has evolved and all of the possibilities that remote work has given us have given us a lot of positive aspects. And nowadays, we can work from, especially in this industry, we can work almost from anywhere, but we need to be mindful also about what that is making to us, having all of these options throughout the day, what is making to us as human beings. This is a quote from Barry Schwartz himself, the writer of the Paradox of Choice book, that he coined in 2016. Once people are in the position to be able to work at any time from any place, they face decisions every minute of every day whether or not to be working. And I think that we are living in this permanent state of always being connected, and then we are always deciding, am I going to do a little bit of work right now, even though I'm at my brother's wedding? You know, because it's just taking the smartphone from the pocket and opening Slack or opening your email or something like that. And I believe that we need to think about how these things are impacting us with the current situation, because a couple years ago, maybe a few companies were completely full remote or they were prepared to be remote, but with the COVID-19 crisis, everyone had to support remote work overnight, and we all started working from our houses, and now the future is different, and rightfully so. But at the same time, one thing that this has done to us is that line that separates the work environment and our work lives from our personal lives has become really blurred. Did I? Okay. Has become blurred. And so we are in the house, especially during a lockdown, and we are constantly thinking that should I still be working or should I not be working? Whereas before, you kind of had a separation. If you left the office, it was like already at least a little bit in your mind that you were in a different setup. And during the pandemic, I actually saw this happening and having a big impact on the mental health of friends of mine. Like I said, I have small children, so I have the benefit that I'm forced to stop. When it's like 5 to 6 p.m., I mean, they need to be fed. They need to have their bath. They need all of those things, you know? So I'm forced to stop. There's no other way, and that ends up being good for me. But I have a lot of good friends at my organization that they live alone, or they don't have kids, they don't have those sorts of limitations. And I started seeing progressively how being in the lockdown situation was becoming so intense to them and had an impact on their mental health. So one day I was having a virtual beer with them where it's like 10 p.m., everyone is on a Zoom call having a beer and talking. And I started noticing how they were angry and they were depressed and they were really contemptuous towards other people in the organization. Why? Because before, at the end of the day, they would get out of the office, they would go have dinner with their spouses or with their friends, go for a drink, go to the movies, whatever. Things would get separated, but now it's like whatever's going on work stays forever inside the household. And then they just can't disconnect, and they become angrier, and problems that could have their own space start becoming really, really, really large. And so I guess what I'm trying to say here is that, I mean, the possibilities that technology is giving us are immense, and there are several positive aspects that I recognize as well. The Great Resignation is upon us, as the industry is calling it right now, because the pandemic has shown people that basically they want to reformulate their lives. They want to look at their lives in a different way and start pursuing other goals that are actually really important, okay? That are not just about work, and that probably will make them happier. But at the same time, we need to be mindful that all of these options that technology gives us sometimes may be detrimental to us, because having a lot of options can make that to yourself. Okay, so I talked about a lot of things here today. I've told you a number of stories that have happened to me or that I've seen in front of me where I believe the paradox of choice were at hand. Maybe you can relate to some of them, maybe you don't, but I'm pretty sure that probably most of you will relate to some of your own personal stories. If there's one thing I want you to take from this keynote today, it's just like this idea, this core idea about the paradox of choice. No choice is bad. Some choice is better than no choice. A lot of choice is not necessarily better than just some choice. Yet, we as human beings tend to want more choice most of the times. And if you start acknowledging this, and if you start thinking about this, you'll probably start seeing it happening in front of you. and maybe even embrace some of the constraints that life gives you and make you understand that sometimes those constraints are really important. Those constraints are what allows you to become limitless within your own boundaries. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Very good. Very good. I like it very much. So questions? I don't know. Catch it.
Obrigado. Good talk, man.
Thank you.
How easy is it to know when you're in one situation or the other?
Well, the two situations being,
I've got some constraints that are helping me, or I have some options that are paralyzing me.
yeah. Not easy, man. I think that understanding that you have a lot of options it can usually be easier than the opposite, in the sense that if you feel paralyzed, if you're kind of like even like procrastinating on the decision because you have so much to choose from. You know, I've been in that situation where I'm at the supermarket. This once happened to me. I spent 1 hour deciding on a chocolate bar to offer my grandmother because I had like 30 different chocolate bars to choose from. And that's when you see yourself in that kind of situation, like the Netflix menu situation, in your professional setting, I think that when that happens, it's like, okay, maybe we should approach this in a different way. You know, it's like, don't be afraid to choose something and be ready to choose not the most optimal thing. And then if you want to go back, then you go back. As to having like few options, being too limited, I think that when that happens, I think that we tend to always to believe more than we should that that's happening. So personally, I believe that it's more about understanding, okay, I have few options available here. Maybe I don't have these technologies. I wanted to have these tools. I need to do load testing, and I don't have the tools that I need and whatnot. But is it like, am I completely blocked about moving forward with this activity? Or maybe I can do my first steps and show the value that I want to get out of this certain activity, and then enlarge the options that I have. Did that? Yeah, cool. We're cool. We're cool.
More questions?
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. My question is, I've experienced the same, so I also sometimes reflect on the situation, think I would want less choices at this opportunity, but at the same time, did you think about having more knowledge about the topic makes you open for more choices because you can better choose because you know what's behind it? So is there science about the better you know or the more you've tasted, the more choices you want?
You know, like, let's see if this answers you. So remember the band story? Like, we walked into the recording studio and we were paralyzed and we completely failed. But after a few years, I continued with my music thing and I created a solo project and whatnot. But I started kind of like acknowledging what had happened before. So it was like, hey, now I'm again at a recording studio, but I need to be careful with these things. I've learned that, you know? So I'm just going to pick this, this, and that, and I'm going to work with these things. And for this session, I will forbid myself of considering other options. So I think that the more you see yourself in that situation and progressively trying to improve yourself and being able to deal with having a lot of options in front of you, the more it will help you. Does this help?
More questions? I go to the front, and then I go to you. Here.
Thanks for the presentation. Really, really nice topic. So, like a question, which actually the topic that you mentioned, it's really kind of reminds me of myself. So when I was like started in QA, there was not so much option like 15 years ago. Not so much like online courses to learn programming languages. I just simply had maybe 3 books about Python, MySQL, Linux, and that's it. And I learned from this. And now it's kind of
the opposite.
I'm asking myself. I have Udemy. I have another platform, like dozens, like 10 platforms. So, and now it's harder to focus and harder to find yourself in a position that this is like the right choice for me. So how do I, in this modern society, in the modern world of everything available, how do I focus myself on something that I really will actually use? Like, how can I link it?
Well, I think that taking that own example, I think we shouldn't be afraid of being in the limited situation. And so if you learn about Linux and all of those things 10, 15 years ago through the books, I mean, if you want to learn something new tomorrow, then go with the book approach. Go to the library, check a book that you think will help you, at least from a first view, and then just stick to that and try to constrain yourself to that. I remember seeing, so we had a great talk from Micah here about learning yesterday. She was kind of saying the same thing, like, books are not my thing, they're an option, but they don't work that well for me, so I like watching Udemy courses. So that I just stick to that and I learn through that. So I think that a lot of times we don't realize is that the paradox is happening, that it's like all of the options, should I watch the Udemy course or should I read the book, or maybe I should do everything. And you don't need to do that, you know? And so I think it's a matter of personal discipline and training yourself, but that would be the way I would do it, I think. And for instance, I'm not that much of a book person as well, so I would probably go to the video courses. So there you go.
Okay. Next question.
So, question about the example you made. Here I am. About the example you had about the complex architecture. So, in your opinion, would you say that designing for evolution of a system and keeping that in mind from the get-go is, on average, more often harmful than helpful, or is maybe the presence of a significant use case the deciding factor?
I think that there's a difference between wanting the system to evolve or, on the other hand, wanting to keep our options open. Okay? Those are 2 different things. And I mean, creating something with a little bit of complexity for testability, for evolutionary purposes, perfectly fine. I do it all the time. I advocate for that. But I want to keep my options open, and I'm afraid of, like, if the third party does this and then I have to rewrite a lot of stuff. I don't think that in most situations that's a solid rationale.
So it's basically not options for options' sake.
Yeah, exactly.
Would you say that experience helps to deal with a higher number of choices?
Absolutely.
Like, no offense, but you as the kids entering the recording studio, I guess like most of the instruments, you didn't know what's the difference.
Yeah.
Projecting that to the professional area, if you need to do load testing and you only know J-meter, don't even know the difference to Gatling, you just choose the best or something. But as a very experienced guy, you know the differences. You know the task and what to select?
Yeah, I would say so, I think. And that relates well, you know, like if you have that example, J-meter versus Gatling, I mean, you start understanding what are the differences. Maybe you're like, okay, this tool fits in this scope of tools that there are many competitors, but I'm used to using that, and it serves that purpose, but I don't need to concern myself with the others. And having that experience helps a lot. The same way it helps when picking out instruments and whatnot, you know?
Thanks.
Thanks so much. The very last question. So.
So thanks for the talk. And other than maybe watching your keynote, is there something that you could recommend to help dissuade people from trying to keep their options open?
Thank you.
Good question. I would probably just try to argue with the same arguments I've brought you here today, you know, and advocate for that. Because a lot of times, I think that I've never seen someone saying, if someone say, I want to keep my options open, I've rarely seen anyone say, hey, that's actually probably not a good thing for us to do. So just being like the first person in that position saying, have we considered that having a lot of options is actually not good? That's like the official Western society's dogma, you know? And just going that route, I think that I need to try it out more, because all of those situations where I've seen one situation that I want to keep my options open with my previous boss, and looking back now, I think we shouldn't have done that, and I should have said something at the time. So it's the best I have for you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.